Leon Panetta 2025 Lecture Series. What will be the legacy of the Trump era? This lecture discusses Russia, China, the Middle East, the Panama Canal. What will be the foreign policy legacy of the Trump era? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everyone. What a wonderful turnout. It's with great pleasure that I welcome each and every one of you to the third discussion in the 2025 Leon Panetta Lecture Series. We are, once again, here live in Leon's hometown of Monterey at the beautiful Monterey Conference Center. Tonight, we continue our discussion on the Trump presidency and the impact he will have on our nation and the world. Our focus tonight is foreign policy. President Trump's return to office has brought a very different approach to dealing with the challenges in the world. Since World War II, U.S. foreign policy under Democratic and Republican presidents stood for common principles. The U.S. provided world leadership, supported alliances, believed in the sovereignty of countries and democratic values, and could be trusted to stand up to tyrants. President Trump believes past presidents were weak and allowed adversaries and allies to take advantage of the United States. The result was unfair trade agreements, lost jobs, trade deficits, open borders, and dependence on U.S. aid. He believes that America is better off on its own. The president believes in the art of the deal as the best way to right the wrongs of the past. But, as we've seen, that doesn't always work. The Wall Street Journal has been critical of his approach to tariff policies and has yet to achieve peace in Gaza and Ukraine. Does a strongman American foreign policy actually strengthen or weaken our security? As Trump challenges the traditional global order, what will be America's role in the world? Can we isolate ourselves from the threats to peace in a dangerous world? Secretary Panetta will pose these critical questions to a distinguished panel of foreign policy experts who understand the diplomatic and military complexities of our dangerous world. Our first guest is one of America's most celebrated diplomats. He has served 6 presidents and 9 secretaries of state. He served in the American Consulate General in Jerusalem, where he coordinated U.S. economic assistance to Palestinians on the West Bank. He was director for Soviet affairs for President George H.W. Bush, and served as senior director and special assistant to President Clinton for Russia and Ukraine affairs. As ambassador to NATO, he led U.S. efforts on 9/11 when the alliance invoked Article 5 in defense of the United States. He just completed his post as U.S. ambassador to the People's Republic of China. So please welcome Ambassador Nicholas Burns. Our next guest is a distinguished statesman and veteran, the 68th U.S. Secretary of State and America's first presidential envoy for climate. From 1985 to 2013, he served as a U.S. Senator representing Massachusetts and was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2009 to 2011. As America's top diplomat, he guided the State Department's strategy on nuclear nonproliferation, combating radical extremism, and the threat of climate change. His tenure was marked by the successful negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Agreement. On May 3, 2024, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of his lifelong commitment to public service. Now please welcome Secretary John Kerry. Right over there. Our next guest is a retired United States Navy Rear Admiral who served as White House National Security Communications Advisor from 2022 to 2025. Prior to this role, he served as an assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, where he advised Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III and served as the Pentagon's chief spokesperson. He previously served at the Department of State as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Public Affairs and as the department's spokesperson. Before his time at the State Department, he was the Pentagon Press Secretary under Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, the first uniformed officer to hold the position. Please welcome Rear Admiral John Kirby. Our fourth and final guest was the 25th United States National Security Advisor and served in President Trump's first administration. He served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years before retiring as a lieutenant general in June 2018. He has extensive experience leading soldiers and organizations in wartime, including in Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom and in Iraq during Operation Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom. His military awards include the Silver Star Medal, the Bronze Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Purple Heart. He is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, including his most recent called At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House. Please welcome Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. And of course, moderating our discussion is the creator of this lecture series and the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. He knows a lot about our dangerous world and the essential role of American leadership. Please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the third forum of the Panetta Lecture Series. Our theme is the legacy of the Trump era. We've looked at the economy, we've looked at law enforcement, and tonight we focus on something that is very much in the news, Trump's foreign policy. As Sylvia pointed out, for the last 80 years since World War II, presidents, Republican and Democrat, despite their political differences, shared some very common principles when it came to foreign policy. The importance of world leadership, the importance of strong alliances, democratic values, trust in our word, and our will to stand up to tyrants. And Ronald Reagan's favorite term, peace through strength. President Trump, on the other hand, as he's emphasized in his recent Middle East trip, he believes that the United States and other countries should really take care of their own problems, invest in business deals, invest in each other. He believes that past presidents allowed adversaries and allies alike to take advantage of U.S. wealth and U.S. power. The U.S. got too involved in their policies and should focus rather on America first and the art of the deal. The problem is, whether we like it or not, that we do live in a global world. And it's a global world that is interconnected by finance, by trade, by security, communications, technology, energy, climate, immigration, and other areas as well. The president is finding that it's difficult to ignore the global world we live in. He's found that out with his tariff policies, the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, and the nuclear threats that we've seen in India, Pakistan, and Iran. So it raises some very important questions for all of us. If we walk away from the rest of the world, is our security threatened by the damage to our credibility? Are business deals enough of a deterrent to protect our security in the future? If we fail to stand up to tyrants, who is left to defend democratic values? What kind of foreign policy legacy are we leaving our children? These are all tough questions and challenges, but we have a very distinguished panel of experts to respond to those questions. And let me begin by asking really the question of the moment, which is just exactly what is Trump's foreign policy? He's been labeled a realist, a nationalist, an isolationist, an imperialist, a deal maker. What exactly are the key strengths and weaknesses of the Trump foreign policy? And nobody better to first answer that question than H.R. McMaster, who was his national security advisor in the first term.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Secretary. Thanks to all of you for the opportunity to be with you and to be, for all of you to be part of this distinguished panel here. And hey, I just want to say, I think that it's clear that Trump doesn't have a real ideology that drives him or a particular worldview. He has a series of emotions and impulses that drive decisions that he makes in the context of his foreign policy. He is reflexively contrarian. I mean, I think we all see that in him. If we were all to go to him and say, hey, this panel of experts here or anywhere, we all agree this should be your foreign policy, he's likely to do the opposite just to spite everybody. You know? But besides that, he does have, as you already alluded to, Mr. Secretary, a sense of aggrievement that America's been taken advantage of. He's tapped into that impulse and that feeling among many Americans, right, who see Europe in particular as a part of the world that accounts for about 17% of the world's GDP, but about 50% of the world's social spending. And so a lot of Americans have concluded, hey, we're underwriting European social programs by covering their defense bills. This is not a new phenomenon, and multiple American presidents have asked our European allies to share more of the burden. He sees that part of the disappointment in the alliance, but he undervalues the strength of alliances in terms of burden sharing for defense and sort of the intangible strengths we get from working together with like-minded partners in a way that's consistent with our common principles. And so, you know, what we, I think, need to do, all of us, is explain to Americans the value of these alliances, because I know all of us are generally internationalists who see that value, and we kind of take it for granted. but large numbers of Americans who have been buffeted by a series of blows, I would say, since the 2000s. Certainly, the mass murder attacks of 9/11. After that, the unanticipated length and difficulty and costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then, toss into that a financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Hey, how about an opioid epidemic? And then going even further forward than that, the COVID pandemic and the violence that followed George Floyd's murder, the divisions in our society. Now toss on top of that social media, right? And the degree to which social media gets more and more advertising dollars through more and more clicks and gets those clicks through more and more extreme content and conspiracy theories and so forth. So all of this, I think, has reduced Americans' confidence in our ability to advance our interests abroad. And they're saying, hey, we have got problems here. Let's solve our problems. Let those Europeans deal with their problems. Let those people in the Middle East deal with their problems. It's not our problem. So I think he taps into that impulse. He feels it himself to a certain extent. And I think that's why you see this deep skepticism in what we think is the post-World War II consensus, a consensus that has prevented major power conflict for 80 years. So I think it's not necessarily a worldview that he has or an ideology. It's more of this impulse, and it's reinforced by some of his most loyal political supporters.
John?
I don't know if I can improve upon that, but what strikes me is the number of times when I've listened to him or his folks talk out there about the word deal. It comes up all the time. So to me, it seems like the foreign policies he's executing is very transactional. And there might be some benefit to that. I mean, obviously, every administration tries to strike certain deals around the world. But if you are only looking at the world through that prism, through a transactional prism, you're probably going to miss what you mentioned in the opening, sir, that is an interconnected world out there. And that what you do in one place is probably going to affect what you're doing somewhere else. My former boss, Secretary Kerry, used to say there's nothing foreign about foreign policy. It all comes back to us here at home and to our allies and partners around the world. So I worry that while certainly there's a place to make deals, and he certainly has tried to do that, I worry that in doing that, he's looking through a soda straw and maybe not looking at the entire global effort at large.
John?
Well, first of all, Leon, thank you very, very much for assembling us and bringing us together. I had long wanted to see your modest walnut operation out here, which is now becoming far more sophisticated as a venture. But it's really a pleasure to be here and be with you and with the three other colleagues here, each of whom I know and have had the privilege of working with. I think if you just try to characterize President Trump's foreign policy, it's mostly a domestic policy, not a foreign policy. And it is chaotic, ad hoc, shoot from the hip on occasion, not too few occasions. And it is both quixotic and arrogant and reckless, with sometimes the best of intentions, making peace with, in Ukraine or making peace in the Middle East and so forth, honorable, proper instinct. But there's nothing there that suggests it's guided by experience and wisdom as to how you, in fact, negotiate a deal. Isolationism has been with America most of our lives. You can go back to World War II, Lindbergh, others. You go back to World War I. And prior to that, perhaps up until about 1898, when Admiral Perry sailed into Manila Bay, and all of a sudden America began to flex its muscles abroad. And if you measure the last century against sort of where we are today, where we are, that is, as the Biden administration left and the Trump administration came in, fewer people were dying violently around the world than at any time in human history. Diseases were being cured. AIDS in Africa, Bill Gates and his efforts and the government cooperating with it. We put $30 billion into that. We were on the verge of the first generation of children born in Africa being born AIDS-free. We stopped Ebola in its tracks with President Obama. We got 1,300 tons of chemical weapons out of Syria while it was in the middle of a conflict before ISIS took over, which if they'd gotten those weapons, we'd be living in a very different world. So you can run through a long series of things. Ukraine. Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. Ukraine is about a dictator, some would call him evil, who has, against all of the mores and standards and virtues that we put in place since World War II, that he went against it, taking over a smaller nation's property. It's against international law. And everything we have done as a nation, everything you've done as citizens, has been geared towards trying to buttress that international structure. And indeed, President Trump does what both John and General McMaster have said, which is sort of the sense of, oh, take care of business here. Don't be doing it over there. Don't be doing it over there. You know, let them take care of themselves. Well, folks, I was a kid in Berlin, Germany in the 1950s, early 50s. I'm dating myself. I just turned 80. And I'm busy convincing people that 80 is the new 55. So I see a few of you out there who probably agree with me. You know, and I want you to know I can do all the things I did when I was 55. I just don't remember what they are. Anyway, I'm lying. I'm not telling the truth. But let me just say to you, I remember seeing buildings where a plaque went up saying, built with Marshall Fund, with, you know, aid of the United States of America and the Marshall Fund. Boy, that rang a bell in me at 12 and 13 years old. And when I visited, I've many times gone back to Normandy. I went back with John and others. You know, you see those beaches, you look at those crosses, and you think about what America did to create this structure, which has made the world safer. Controlled atomic weapons, kept Europeans even from killing each other, which was part of the purpose of the creation of the EU. Diplomacy is absolutely critical in building relationships. There's no mystery as to what diplomacy is. It's personal relationships. It's building them. It's getting people to say yes. I could not have gotten the Iran nuclear agreement done if President Putin hadn't sat there with me in the Kremlin and said, okay, I'll help you with this. We will do this. You know who got those weapons out of Syria and took them and destroyed them? Russia, in our cooperation. So, you know, when you come in and say we're going to make Canada the 51st state, we're going to take over Greenland, we're going to call the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America by fiat edict. Doesn't mean it's not a good idea, but work at it. Get them to say, you know what, we've decided. The absence of any of that kind of groundwork, trying to play with something as critical as peace in Ukraine, with this public messaging from the Middle East where you're raking in trillions of dollars, and most Americans don't know what the hell they're for. When you see that happening, and you begin to realize that there's no plan here. You don't just set up a summit without the preparation and understanding where it's going. You certainly don't put on the table, as this administration did, the deal, which includes giving back Crimea, which we've never agreed to. The whole world has said that was a taking, not permissive, and it stands that way, unresolved. That's a huge chip to offer Putin if you're in the negotiation. But to just put it out there, say you got Crimea, or you got this, if you were Zelensky, you'd be more angry and frustrated than he is anyway. So, folks, we have to behave in this beautiful, unbelievably responsible role the world has given us because we do know how to get it done. And I found, and I know Nick will agree with me, in the absence of the United States taking a resolution to enforce the law, or a resolution to enforce human rights, or a resolution to deal with genocide. Absent that, you show me when you saw China or Russia or a lot of urban and Hungary, when they took that resolution to the UN and fought for it. Never. We are the force. We, as Madeleine Albright often reminds us, we're the indispensable nation. And you can shy away from it or you can embrace it. And I believe that it's important for us to embrace it because the world wants to work with us. And our technology and our knowledge and our, we just lost 4 professors who resigned from Harvard and they're going over to Europe because they think they can't work here now. That's happening all across our country. We are our own worst enemy. We can't pass a budget. We don't get things done. We're not building great things in America. And we have to show the world that we actually can carry this responsibility, because without it, it's going to be extremely difficult to hand the world to our children and grandchildren in better shape than we have been given it.
Okay, Nick.
First of all, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Real pleasure to be here, and I must say, as someone, the spring has just come to our hometown, Boston, Massachusetts. It's so beautiful. Your part of the country, Monterey, to get up this morning and see the Pacific Ocean. I'm really delighted to be here, but also delighted to be here. I think the 4 of us are, to be on the same stage with one of the greatest public servants that this country has produced in the last half century. So thank you very much. So here are a few thoughts, and I think my 3 colleagues have really done the job. Let's give President Trump his due. He understood the American people were concerned about our borders, about the northern border with Canada, but especially the southern border, and he's done something about it. I'm a passionate supporter of legal immigration, but I think everyone believes we've got to control our own border. Second, I think he and Secretary Rubio have focused a lot early on our hemisphere, on the Caribbean, on Central America, on South America. It's a fact that 20 years ago, the United States was a leading trade partner with nearly every country in our hemisphere. And in 2025, China is a leading trade partner with nearly every country in South America, where a lot of the growth is in our hemisphere. So they've done that. President's a deal maker, he's a business leader, he's economically focused, he's been all over trade. Hasn't worked out so well. This idea of reciprocal tariffs, of 145% tariffs on China, of also the tariffs on Japan, South Korea, India, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, our natural allies in the world, scared bond markets, scared the stock market, and really separated ourselves from our natural allies at the beginning of the administration. President Trump, very focused on his relations with other big powers. That's a good thing with Prime Minister Modi of India, who I think all of us on this stage have worked with the Indians, have worked as part of this big effort to grow closer to India. So he's continuing, I think, in that bipartisan tradition. He's been quite solicitous of his relationship with the Japanese, with the South Koreans, tariffs aside, which is also positive. But Leon, I got to tell you, I'm worried this early in the administration, and very much agree with the comments of Admiral Kirby and General McMaster and Secretary Kerry. We've got a real problem in Ukraine. The problem is when you call Ukraine the aggressor and Russia the victim, you've got it. That's an Orwellian statement. And you've got it, it's an Alice in Wonderland statement. You've got it exactly wrong. There's so much at stake for us in stopping Putin in Europe. Europe is the largest investor in our country, in our economy, the largest trade partner of the United States, the largest collection of American allies in the world. And if we let Putin get away with murder, with crime, he's going to divide Europe, which will no longer be what it was after 1989, which is whole, free, and at peace, in the words of H.W. Bush. This is for all the marbles. And President Trump and President Putin talked this morning. The White House issued a very general statement. You can't make heads or tails of what really happened, but the message to Putin should be, we're not going to have a normal relationship. We're going to continue to sanction you until you deal in good faith with Ukraine and respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. I worry about that. I worry about allies. Thank you. I learned a lot about allies in my career. I was ambassador to NATO on 9/11, and we were hit, as everybody in this room remembers, really hard on 9/11. I find it ironic to say tonight that the first person who came to me in the NATO alliance 3 hours after the attack was the Canadian ambassador, David Wright, who said to me, "We're with you. We know it's al-Qaeda. We will go into wherever you want us to go with you. We'll go to war with you." And they led the way. The Canadians and the Danes led the way on 9/11 to say to you can't make this up, to say to the rest of the alliance, an attack on one is an attack on all. That's what Article 5 was. And the next morning, we, by consensus, 19 countries then agreed that we would act together. And as HR knows, General McMaster, all of those NATO countries went in and bled for us. And with you as a soldier in Afghanistan, in Iraq, they were there with us. You know, if we didn't have NATO and the East Asian alliances, we'd try to create them. And that's the other thing that I learned in China, as we were trying to convince the Chinese not to arm the Russians with microelectronics for the Russian defense industrial base, which they've done. Who was on our side? The Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, and the NATO allies. As we tried to defend the Philippines from Chinese aggression, tried to build up the defenses of Taiwan, who was on our side? All those allies. And I used to try to think about the real problem we have with China. They're a near peer power of the United States in their economic, technological, and military power. But if you measure us 1 to 1, it's pretty close, which is a frightening thought, because none of us want China to be the strongest country in the world. But if you add to our side of the equation just two other, Japan and the European Union, that's 60% of global GDP. We outweigh the Chinese in economic and military and political power. So allies are critical for our country, and all of us have had the incredible honor of serving our country. Leon is Secretary of Defense, and he knows that we can't live alone in the world. And you said it in your introduction, and you're right. And President Trump's disavowal of our allies and the extraordinarily offensive comments he's made against Denmark and Canada in particular, no way to run an alliance. Last point. President Trump gave a speech in the Middle East this past weekend, the biggest speech of his presidency, calling it the Trump Doctrine, about what we stand for as a nation and what his foreign and defense policy will be. You know what the kicker was, the line that the White House promoted? We're not going to judge anybody on human rights anymore, or the rule of law, or whether you allow freedom of religion in your country, or whether you don't lock up people who protest against your authoritarian regime. He said, you're all off the hook. He said, that's the failed policy of the past. We're not going to judge you. And I was really happy to read this morning in the lead editorial in the Wall Street Journal when they said, that's not who we are. Because I think in my career, which started in 1980, and I worked for Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, what really makes us great and different is the rule of law, it's the Bill of Rights, it's the freedoms that we hold dear and that we expect the rest of the world to adhere to as well, when that's possible. And President Trump gave that away for his presidency this weekend. So I think he made some good steps in our own hemisphere, not all, but some. But I'm really worried about how he's positioned us as a global leader.
Okay. Well, I started with that question so that you could get it all out of your system.
You all did.
Now, I'm going to ask you to be a little brief as we go through a lot of other questions on foreign policy. Let me go to his trip to the Middle East. Visited Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE. A lot of issues in the Middle East: Gaza war, hostages, concerns about humanitarian aid, Iran nuclear negotiations, Syria, terrorism. Trump did remove sanctions from Syria. He bypassed Israel on the release of the last American hostage. He did make a pitch to Saudi Arabia on the Abraham Accords. How would you assess the president's first trip abroad? Start with you, Nick.
Well, it's interesting, you know, and Secretary Kerry knows this, for presidents and Secretary of State, where you go in your first trip is a signal for what's important. And, you know, you can make a case you should go to Canada and Mexico first, or an allied country, Japan or Germany. The Middle East, I guess, makes sense because energy is such an important part of the balance of power in the world today, and we have such tight historic relations with those Arab authoritarian countries. So I understood it in that respect. I understood it because we want those countries to normalize relations with Israel, which is an important goal of ours, bipartisan goal of ours. We want those countries to help fund what has to happen, and that is humanitarian relief for the people of Gaza. The poor Palestinian population, they don't support Hamas in great numbers, but they're now been victimized. So you need those countries. So I guess I understood it. I would have counseled an ally country, but I understood his choice. I didn't understand the message on human rights and on democratic freedoms. I think what strengthens I think of Ronald Reagan, for whom I worked as a very young junior officer. You know, he stood up and represented the values of this country when he went to the Berlin Wall and told Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And every president of both parties has done that, and that's what was glaring from the trip this week.
Okay. John, any reaction to the trip?
Well, I think Nick has well summarized it. I would add to that that these are countries in great transition, all of them. What the UAE has done in the last years is really quite astounding. I mean, 50 years ago, there was sand only. And now there's these absolutely amazing cities and architecture and airports that are the envy of the world, and airlines of their own, and artificial intelligence, a Cleveland Clinic. I mean, it's just stunning, the development that's taken place. And it's been done because we've worked, really closely, and because they are really creative. They have creative leadership. And when we were negotiating the latest climate agreement in Dubai, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, the head of their oil company, was appointed by them to be the president of the Conference of the Parties of the UN on this subject. And everybody was, a lot of people were angry, saying, how can you have an oil company executive be in charge of this? Well, guess what? They brought other companies to the table. They actually proactively went out and brought them to the table and helped to create a consensus. And that consensus came up with the strongest mandate yet for what we have to do about the climate crisis. Moreover, they took the lead in the Abraham Accords. Now, the Abraham Accords are welcome, they're helpful, but they don't take things as far as we need to go with respect to changing the dynamic of the Middle East, which is locked into a really bad place. I tried very, very hard over 4 years, actually longer, because as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I was also involved, to try to move the peace process forward. In 1993, the Oslo Accords were signed, which was an agreement on the steady transfer of land from the West Bank and Gaza to the Palestinians for their control. And the reality is that that transfer has never really taken place. So we are now gone from 100,000 settlers that used to be in the West Bank. It's 650,000 now. And they're being armed by this current government. And they're going in and killing Palestinians. So I think to have what's coming out of Gaza, all of us, there isn't a person here who doesn't feel hugely sympathetic with the trauma that was created in Israel as a consequence of what happened on October 7th. And really it changed the discussion. It has to have changed the discussion, which is why people know Hamas is a problem, you've got to go after it. But, a 2,000-pound bomb taking out women and children in a building, many people, President Biden and others, cautioned that there's a way militarily to do this that doesn't quite require such a frontal assault. To have no real discussion of that in this trip, it seems to me, is a kind of permissiveness created and not a serious step in foreign policy to put on the table one of the greatest challenges we face, where the Arab world is now very much poised to be really constructive in moving this forward to the next step after the Abraham Accords. So I would have hoped for some discussion about Gaza, about the ceasefire, about the changes needed, with the appropriate balance between the grievances that are legitimate by Israel towards the circlement that's been there for years, moving in now to a more productive.
Let me ask John and HR, what are the chances of trying to get a ceasefire in Gaza? Now, we know the situation is rough. Israel has said they're going to try to take over Gaza. There's a humanitarian problem with the people there. We still have hostages that have not been released. We did have some ceasefires. Can the U.S. do anything to try to push Israel on a ceasefire?
Yes, sir. I think we can and we should. I'm not Pollyannish about it. It's not going to be easy to get another ceasefire in place. We know that from experience. We got 2 of them in the Biden administration. The last one right before we left office. It's difficult because the 2 sides are so far apart, and really it came down to details like who was going to get released in what group and what their names were. So it's not going to be easy, but I do think that there has been a sense of momentum there. I hope it can continue. Mr. Witkoff clearly speaks for President Trump, and they know that he does. He has that agency. I hope he uses that. But look, the central premise for Hamas is they don't want to leave, and they want all the Israeli soldiers out. That is their bottom line. And for the Israelis, that's unacceptable. There's no way they're just going to give up their military presence there, and they certainly don't, and they shouldn't live in a world where Hamas is in charge right across the border, and another October 7th could happen again. And so when you're starting from those 2 very difficult positions, it'll be hard. But I do think it's possible. I just think it's going to require compromises and leadership in the region.
HR?
I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's actually desirable. And here's the reason. Hamas is the biggest impediment to peace. Hamas launched these attacks on October 7th, 2023. They killed, if adjusted for per capita for our population, that would have been the equivalent of about 33,000 to 35,000 Americans killed on that day. The big lesson, is, as you've already alluded to and Admiral Kirby's alluded to, for Israel is to not allow a terrorist organization that is dedicated to destroying Israel and killing all the Jews to have that kind of capability on their border. The problem, fundamentally, in terms of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, as I see it, is the Palestinian people have not been permitted to flee the war zone. It is the only example in history that I'm aware of that people have been penned in to a geographic area, a dense urban terrain, and the terrorist organization who uses them as human shields is able then to perpetuate the violence against them. Could the Israelis have used firepower, and should they, with greater discipline and discrimination? Heck, yes. But how do you, as Israel, live with a ceasefire when Hamas is still in charge in Gaza? How do you get to any inkling ever, or any possibility at all, of a 2-state solution if Hamas still has the guns in Gaza? Because you can't imagine the emergence of any political entity in Gaza other than Hamas until Hamas is destroyed. Because who wants to be the mayor of Gaza, right? As soon as you raise your hand, you're going to get a bullet in the head. Think about these anti-Hamas protests that just happened 3 weeks ago, and how Hamas brutally suppressed them. Took one of the organizers, tortured him to death, took him to the rooftop of his mother's house and dropped him off the roof to land in front of her door. These are the people you're dealing with, who killed infants, who killed children in front of their parents, who kidnapped and raped women, and are still holding hostages. These are modern-day barbarians who must be destroyed. And so as a precondition for any kind of enduring peace, think about all the advice we gave the Israelis. Don't go into Rafah. They went into Rafah. That's where they liberated a lot of the prisoners, and that's where they killed Hamas's military leader. Don't do this, don't do that. I think Israel had to blow off what we were telling them because we were giving them really bad advice. And I'll tell you, one of the aspects of the bad advice is when you go in on the ground, you actually cause a lot fewer civilian casualties than with bombing. So by telling Israel, don't go into certain neighborhoods, I think we were creating conditions for even more casualties. So I think also they disregarded our advice on southern Lebanon and on Hezbollah. What that led to is the decapitation of Hezbollah and ultimately the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria as well, because the Assad regime was so reliant on Hezbollah. So anyway, I think it's terrible what's happening in Gaza in terms of humanitarian catastrophe, but it will not get any better for the Palestinian people until Hamas is destroyed.
HR, as long as I got you, let me move you quickly to Putin and Ukraine. We know Putin invaded sovereign democracy. The U.S. and NATO tried to support him. They've bravely fought for their country. We've now reached a point where everybody wants to try to achieve some kind of peace. But Putin obviously keeps fighting. He's refused Trump's effort at ceasefire. I'm not sure what the telephone call resulted in, but it looks like we still have a division there. Putin, I think, does sense a weakness in Trump in terms of coming down and really hanging tough on him. Isn't the reality that there will be no peace unless Trump puts more pressure on Putin? Will he do that?
I hope so, Mr. Secretary, but here's what I think is going to happen. I mean, I think that Vladimir Putin's intransigence will convince Donald Trump to back into the policy he should have had from the beginning, which is to do as you suggested, to put a lot more pressure on a very weak Vladimir Putin. And of course, what Putin has been successful at is somehow kind of manipulating Trump's understanding of the nature of that war. The invasion in 2014, the massive re-invasion in 2022, and also how that war fits in to Putin's obsession, his obsession with restoring Russia to greatness, national greatness, and to do so by dragging everybody else down. As Ambassador Burns already alluded to, his ambitions go far beyond Ukraine. He wants to break NATO apart. He wants to rend the transatlantic relationship. How about not helping him do that? And I think what Putin is a master at, because he's a KGB operator, is manipulating other world leaders, including President Trump. Trump is not alone. Remember, George W. Bush looked into his soul. Remember, President Obama tried the reset policy. President Biden went to lay out his red lines in Geneva, which for Putin means, hey, that's a green light for everything else. Look at how he worked over Angela Merkel, who was going to be the Putin whisperer and bring Russia in from the cold. How did that work out? So I think what Putin does masterfully with President Trump is, hey, flattery, right? I mean, President Trump enjoys a little bit of flattery. It'll get you everywhere, right? The next thing he does is he heightens their mutual sense of aggrievement. You can hear President Trump said this in the Oval Office. He's been treated so badly. He's been misunderstood, kind of like me. Right? I mean, really. And then the third thing, you hold out the prospect of a great deal. Okay, Donald, we could get so much done together. I mean, look, we could get rid of nuclear weapons together. We could work on cybersecurity together. I mean, that's pretty laughable. How about we can develop each other's economies. You should buy more from us. We can invest in you. It'll be great. And then finally, he portrays anybody else who has an alternative as weak, or any other course of action as making him look weak. And so you see that play out with Zelensky acting like Ukraine, is completely on the ropes. Sure, they got problems, but actually, Russia's in a position of profound weakness. From an economic perspective, 900,000 casualties in the war. 60% of those casualties have occurred in the last year of that war. So I think there is an opportunity to really stop Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin will not be stopped until he is stopped, because his ambitions go far beyond anything that is in reaction to us and what we do. And that is kind of our own kind of narcissistic view of the world, to assume, that really Vladimir Putin, he's acting the way it's because we've aggrieved him somehow. If we could just allay his security concerns, right, he'll be like the Grinch on Christmas Eve, His heart will grow 2 sizes bigger, and it'll be like it. I mean, so it's not going to happen.
John. John, I've got to turn to our questions from the audience first, but before I do that, John, I've got to ask you the question that I think a lot of people would like. No, John Kerry.
That was the Olay move.
I was trying to get rid of that one.
Look, you negotiated the nuclear agreement with Iran. Took a lot of work, went into place, actually worked pretty well. We then pulled out, got a lot of criticism on the deal. And now...
We didn't pull out. President Trump pulled out.
No, Trump obviously pulled the United States out of the deal. Now, they're trying to get a negotiation with Iran on nuclear enrichment, and the deal looks very much, the elements of what you had worked out. What do you think the chances are that we can get another agreement with Iran?
I think they're actually quite good.
They're what, quite good?
I think they're quite good, yes, I do, because basically the last couple of years have wound up significantly diminishing the power of the Houthi. Hezbollah has been decimated. Assad is gone. There's just such a massive upheaval in the region that Iran has seen a failure in its own strategy. And the result of that is that they actually need this more than they did back when we did it. But I don't think it's going to be a very different arrangement. But I do think the moment is ripe. Their economy is, crashed. They have serious problems moving. And I'm very hopeful that we can get that agreement because we just don't need the potential of a breakout that you can't control. It remains to see whether we agree to some enrichment or not, or how much, et cetera, et cetera. But we had the deal we put together a number of years ago, and I'm not bragging about it on a personal level, but it was the strongest nuclear weapons agreement since the 1950s. It absolutely, we had 130 new observers go in. We destroyed all but the worst of their centrifuges, so they couldn't, in fact, continue to enrich. We had every aspect of the sequence of mining to production of yellowcake for the purpose of enrichment was televised, daily watched, radio seals on everything, television cameras in the, you name it. We had base, and the CIA, the DIA, the defense folks, and the Israeli defense establishment and intelligence establishment all agreed they thought they should try to keep the deal, that it was better to have it in place than not. Now, just 30 seconds I want to agree with HR. You have to change Putin's calculation. Right now, he thinks he's winning. He can do more, significantly, and we have to be in a position to try to deter him from doing that, or at least give the Ukrainians the ability to push back. If we don't, we're begging for, frankly, a defeat of the very policy we've pursued over the course of these last couple of years, and it would be even worse for Europe and the consequences. So to manage that effectively, we don't know what the summary was of that talk today, but because it hasn't been more expressly optimistic and positive, leads me to believe Putin kind of hard-lined it, and he's going to continue to do what he's doing. So the moment will come where he's going to have to, President Trump's going to have to, make a different decision here and begin to deal differently. And the question in a lot of people's minds, frankly, is, given his past relationship with Putin, is can he? Will he? And I think that's a fair question on the table.
One of those moments is this summer, as the military assistance that the Biden administration played out for runs out. The Presidential Drawdown Authority that allows the Department of Defense to pull things off the stocks and give it to Ukraine. The last of that is midsummer. And so the moment's coming where big decisions are going to have to be made about how much more leverage we have and will use against Russia.
No, exactly. Let me take a moment to recognize our question review team, the people who select the questions that will be presented to our speakers. And I ask you to hold your applause until I introduce the entire group. Mike Clancy, who's with KSQD FM 90.7. David Kellogg, who's the managing editor of the Monterey Herald. Pete Waversky, who is the managing editor of the opinion page of San Francisco Chronicle. Doug McKnight could not be with us, but he will be joining us in the future. And Sylvia and I also want to particularly thank the Panetta Institute Board of Directors, the lecture series sponsors that all make these programs possible and allow us to present these important discussions to all of you, our audience watching at home, and with the great students that we had today from across Central and Northern California. So would you please give all of those sponsors a hand? Nick, let me start with you on the threat from China. China has a strong economy. They're involved in a lot of trade, as we found out. They're building a strong military force. They're investing in technology and space, AI, a lot of quantum computing, all of the areas of technology. And they're threatening Taiwan. Is China the greatest threat to our national security today?
Yes. And I think, and I told the students this afternoon, I think for their lifetime too. I mean, China and the United States are the two strongest economies, two strongest militaries, the only two countries in the world with real global reach. China has enormous ambitions under its leader, Xi Jinping, certainly to dominate the Indo-Pacific, which is the most important part of the world, both economically, technologically, and militarily. And I think, obviously, they want to cut the United States and our allies down to size. 3 quick points, because we could have a whole semester at any of the universities here in California on this question. Point 1, think of the competition between us. They are trying to surpass the United States, overtake the US Navy and Air Force in the Indo-Pacific as the primary fighting force with our allies, and the aggressiveness of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the unconstrained military buildup, and the buildup of their nuclear weapons force, which is completely non-transparent. That's a real threat, and we don't want to be the number 2 military power 10 years from now. Technology moved to center stage. That's another point of competition during my ambassadorship. So if you think about the race for commercial advantage in AI, quantum computing, where the Chinese just put $15 billion in state money to compete with American firms, biotechnology, and then understand that all of those technologies will produce spin-offs for military technology. We're looking at a big change in military technology. China wants to be number 1 in that space. Think about trade and economics. Here's where it gets complicated, by the way. China's our third largest trade partner after Canada and Mexico. $642 billion last year. More than 10,000 American companies there. 1 million American jobs depend on trade with China. Very competitive, and the Chinese trying to dump their excess manufactured products, think of steel, robotics, EVs, lithium batteries, solar panels, on our markets. So who raised tariffs on China? President Biden. A year ago this month, 100% on Chinese EVs, 25% on Chinese lithium batteries. And then we've talked about human rights. That's the big difference between us. This is a centrally planned Communist Party economy and society. No human rights allowed to speak of. We disagree. So this is going to be a competition as long as Xi Jinping's in power well into the next decade. But here's where it gets really complicated. If China's our number 1 threat, competitor, adversary, China's also, in some ways, our indispensable partner on climate change, where I can just say, because I worked with him very closely, John Kerry did splendid work on behalf of our country, and I would say the globe, on climate change, and worked very effectively with his Chinese counterparts. On fentanyl, our greatest public health crisis, we can't resolve it without China because most of the precursor chemicals come from China. On the next pandemic and law of averages, we've had 4 since in the last 20 years. Law of averages, we'll have another. We're going to have to work with China. It has enormous capacity. So what I found complicated about this whole, my job, and I had great good fortune to serve under President Biden's leadership and deeply respect what he has done for our country, is that on the one hand, I spent about 80% of my time in the competitive edge, but I had to spend some time in the cooperative edge with John and others because you have to do both. Last point, and President Biden and I always said this to us, we cannot fight China. We have to live in peace with China. It would be criminal and insane for us to get close to any kind of nuclear war with China. And so it makes this really complicated, this whole relationship. And I think I'm proud of the work that we did under President Biden's leadership. Thought he had the right policy. And I'm not going to say anything negative about President Trump because I think what's been interesting about the first 4 months of the Trump presidency, the focus has been on borders, Latin America, Ukraine, tariffs. We really haven't seen the Trump administration roll out their theory of the case. I hope it's closer to ours because I think we had some measure of success, at least in stabilizing the relationship.
Okay, so big question. What do you think the chances are that they will attack Taiwan?
What we have said publicly, what I said, what Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense said consistently is low probability in the next few years. This 2027 date, I think, has been misunderstood. The best we know, and Xi Jinping runs a highly opaque government, is that he wants the People's Liberation Army to be ready by 2027. But I think Xi Jinping, he's not a risk taker. He's not like Putin. He's rational. He's going to have to look at the odds. Crossing, HR would know this better than me, but crossing 100 miles of open water with a combined forces operation against Taiwan, if they're smart and they're getting really smart about this, is going to learn a lot from how the Ukrainians held off the Russian armed forces with drone technology. This would be a big risk for the Chinese, and they would face massive global sanctions if they did it. So does Xi Jinping want to get Taiwan back? Absolutely. We have to make Taiwan a tough nut to crack. We've got to expand our assistance. And I've been encouraged, by the way, by Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hegseth's statements that they've already begun to funnel arms to Taiwan, and I'm glad they're doing it. So I don't see it happening momentarily.
HR, there's some question about whether Trump would defend Taiwan. What's your sense?
Well, that's been, been our policy, strategic ambiguity. I just don't know. President Trump, he sometimes carries these kind of opposing views in his mind, right? He understands peace through strength. He understands that it's much better to prevent a war than have to fight one. President Biden was the first president who ever said unequivocally, 3 times, he said, hey, we would defend Taiwan. I think it's important to preserve a degree of ambiguity because we don't know what the American people would support. This would be something I think the Congress would have to authorize us to go to war. And the second thing is we really do want the Taiwanese to take responsibility for their own defense, which they're doing. Although it's a battleground there. It's a political battleground where China is supporting one of the a wing of one of the parties, and what China really wants to do is to get annexation by invitation, by reducing Taiwan's will to defend their independence. But there's about $22 billion of backlogged arms sales to Taiwan. It's not assistance. I mean, they bought it, right, from U.S. companies. And so accelerating those capabilities to Taiwan, I think, would be the #1 priority. I think there's been a high degree of continuity, actually, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on China and the importance of competing effectively with China and the importance of deterring China through strength, right? By convincing China it can't accomplish its objectives through the use of force. On Taiwan, you already alluded to this, Ambassador, 100, and Secretary Panetta, 100 to 150 miles of water that is really turbulent, all but like 2 months out of the year. You have an island that is the size of Maryland, that's very mountainous in the east, that has like mud flats and dense urban areas in the west. It's a very difficult military problem. I think what is much more likely is to see an acceleration of what we've already seen, which is a tightening of the coercive campaign against Taiwan and redoubled efforts to subvert, political subversion, cyber-enabled information warfare, co-option and paying off of elites, reducing their will to defend themselves. And maybe something like a quarantine, right, or indirect control, some people are calling this. I think that could be, I think there's a pretty high chance of that in the next few years. because of Xi Jinping's promises that he's made, but saying this is no longer a short-term problem. And also, I think he's preparing China for war. I mean, I'd love to hear what you think about this, Ambassador, but when I look at what he's doing to the economy, doubling down on production when other elements of the economy are failing, what he's telling his population, you may need to sacrifice. The massive buildup of the nuclear force, for example. I mean, this all seems to me like he's preparing China for war.
In HR, I think the Chinese are watching what we do in Ukraine.
Yes.
And if we let Putin off the hook, I think that then elevates the probability of some type of action. I agree with you, probably more a blockade than an outright invasion of Taiwan.
Okay, in the spirit of equal time, there's a new book called Original Sin that basically says the White House staff engaged in a cover-up of Biden's age problems. Some of you had direct communications with Joe Biden as president. What were your impressions? John Kirby, let's start with you. You probably had the most.
Yes, sir. Look, I haven't read the book. I don't plan to read it. I didn't see that. I just didn't. Now, to be fair, I wasn't with the president every single day, but I was with him enough, and on all the trips with him. And in my interactions with him, he was laser focused on the national security problems we were facing. He was very keenly engaged with our allies and partners all overseas, and really working his personal relationships quite well. He was thoughtful, he was measured, he was deliberate. He welcomed debate. He wanted his assumptions challenged. I challenge anybody to just, and I get not everybody agrees with the agenda that Mr. Biden executed overseas, but you can't look at what he said he was going to do and what was important to him as president and commander-in-chief and not look at the results that went to those ends. Did we achieve everything we wanted? No. And did everything go according to plan? Of course not. But what he said he wanted to accomplish out there, we worked on, and I think the results speak for themselves. I just don't think that when you look at him as president, that you can say, you know, he wasn't in command of his faculties.
John Kerry?
In all the meetings I had with the president in the White House or elsewhere, he was a tough taskmaster. He was demanding full vetting of issues. He would sit there and listen. He'd make a decision, or he wouldn't then, but he'd take it under advisement. But the only thing I did notice was sort of a slight, slowing of his gait, of his maneuverability, but not anything that impaired his capacity as president to make the decisions that he did make. And by the way, if you look at his accomplishments, this president accomplished more positive legislation, the infrastructure bill, health care, Medicare, but a whole bunch of things, more than any president since Lyndon Johnson. And I think he's getting short shrift on that.
John, you ran for president and served a great deal in the
It was the longest administration
Senate.
in history, about a day.
What will it take for Democrats to get their act together politically?
Well, I think we ought to start by people stopping wetting their bed over this issue. I think we got to understand that our system works. We have a different system. Our system works, and sometimes people get clobbered. I can remember in Lyndon Johnson's massive defeat of Barry Goldwater, everybody wrote the next day, the Republican Party is dead, it's gone, it's never going to be back. And 4 years later, Richard Nixon was president. So I just don't put a lot of value in it. It will develop. There's nothing we can do about it right now anyway, because you have the House and Senate and the White House all in the control of one party. And there's no way to change that until the midterms next year. I believe we will change that in the midterms next year. And then you'll have a greater statement about the direction the country's going, or maybe not, but the fight will be joined because President Trump is a lame duck, because the people in his party vying for the nomination will start running around, the people in our party will start running around, and someone will emerge. and that's just the way it works. So I don't think it's valuable to be saying, oh, who's there? We don't have anybody now. Da, da, da. It'll happen. That's the virtue of America. People can speak anywhere at any time, go out, campaign, and it's a great process. I know that all of you know that when I was running, and telling people that I was going to wind up in the White House, I really meant as envoy for climate, which we need to talk about a little bit.
HR, in the midst of a very dangerous world, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, terrorism, Trump has also threatened to take over Greenland, make Canada a 51st state, and regain control of the Panama Canal. What the hell is going on?
Well, hey, President Trump says outlandish things, right? That's not a news flash to anybody. Oftentimes, there's kind of a kernel of what he wants to get at there, right? So, for example, with Greenland, it's Arctic security. Arctic security is important. We've undervalued it. Now, what is the best way to get at Arctic security? It would be to work with Denmark and with the people of Greenland to say, hey, we would like to be more active in securing the Arctic and for you to be a closer partner. But no, I mean, why not? Why do it the easy way when you can do it the hard way? Or in Panama, for example, the argument is really about Panamanian sovereignty and having a Chinese owned company, Hong Kong company, that has to act by law as an arm of the Chinese Communist Party, controlling both sides of the Panama Canal. So what you say is, hey, we're on the side of Panamanian sovereignty, and we think that this should be a U.S. or like another international company. How can we help you do this? But instead, by saying we want to annex the canal, we take that sovereignty argument away from ourselves. So this is kind of typical with President Trump. He's disruptive. There's a lot of things that need to be disrupted, but he's so disruptive that oftentimes he disrupts himself, and his own agenda. And so I think that is what is at those two. But oftentimes I would say to him, I've said this many times, I would say, Mr. President, if we shoot all of our allies to get to China, China wins, and so I think it's really important for us, for him to realize that he can accomplish so much more through multinational cooperation. That doesn't make him a globalist, but I did joke with him when he went to Davos. I said, hey, I think you're a globalist now, I mean, you're Davos. But I think that he will back into that recognition. And I think what happens with President Trump, he learns conversationally. So he can either talk to Vladimir Putin or he can talk to other leaders like in Europe. So one of the things I think is really positive for him is when he engages his counterparts. With the exception of the Zelensky meeting, Trump is a very welcoming, gracious host, right? He's in the hospitality business, kind of. He does listen, and I just hope maybe doesn't listen as well. Well, he was never really a great listener, I guess. But he does. He does listen and evolve his understanding. So what I'm hopeful for is, again, that he will kind of back in to this purposeful internationalist approach and realize that's the way to advance American interests. The other path he could take is this kind of spheres of influence view of the world, right? Where we withdraw to the Western Hemisphere. We come up with like a G2 agreement with China, which is what China would love to talk him into, and say, well, Europe, that's parts of Europe or the Black Sea, that's Russia's, and just divide the world up into these spheres of influence. That would be really bad for American interests and really bad for the free world if it evolves that way. But there's a chance, I'm telling you, a high chance. And I've got my money on Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Ayatollah Khamenei, and Kim Jong-un. They're all going to convince Trump that the best course of action is peace through strength. And we'll get peace through strength, Trump, who will back in to a purposeful America first but internationalist approach to the world. Let's all keep our fingers crossed on that. All right.
Does it not strike you as really kind of scary that you have to wait for all those things?
Well, he loves a big deal, right? But he's not going to get the big deal, I don't think.
But the learning curve you're describing is pretty awesome.
John Kirby, you've dealt with a lot of classified material. It's difficult to understand how a signal network that was not secure was used to discuss classified attack plans. Secretary of Defense used it to discuss sensitive issues with his wife, his brother, and his lawyer. Was this mistake based on a lack of experience in the job or sheer negligence?
Negligence. I mean, there's no other way of getting around it.
I mean,
it is not.
Who should be held accountable in that situation?
Well, it looks like Mike Waltz was already held accountable. I think clearly the Secretary of Defense has culpability here. I mean, I saw him on his tarmac doing his interview, and he's saying, these weren't war plans, and he's parsing out the words. When you put on an unclassified phone the time at which an F-18 has taken off and where it's going to drop its bombs, that's an attack plan. That clearly is getting ahead of an operation and putting those pilots in harm's way. So it was utter negligence. It was stupid. And I think obviously they've learned from this, or at least you would hope that they've learned from this. But I find it very ironic, an administration coming in, particularly at the Pentagon, and Mr. Hegseth says he's all about accountability, and we're going to hold people accountable, and we're going to raise the standards. And then this is just nothing, poof. It just, they make Mike Waltz the UN ambassador, and then that's it. And you try to get the story to go away. It was a serious breach of security protocol, and it was a serious breach of national security.
Yeah, I cannot imagine attack plans being discussed on an open network. I mean, that's nuts.
And if you had done it, sir, as SecDef, or me as your spokesman, we certainly would have been held accountable.
Let's talk to Nick. If the Chinese have placed their cyber weapons into our critical infrastructure, how ready are we as a nation to be able to defend ourselves?
I think this is, if you think about the threat from China, if there is going to be a war, maybe not with us at the center of it, but some kind of localized war, it's going to be a space-based war and a cyber war. The Chinese are putting enormous resources into their offensive cyber capacity. If you don't take my word for it, the person who I think has spoke most frankly to the American public is Chris Wray, our excellent FBI director, resigned in January. He gave a series of public speeches and open congressional testimony in 23 and 24, and he said China is by far and away the most pernicious, powerful threat to the United States on cyber. We were talking to the students this afternoon about how important it is that we raise our defenses. What Chris said, Director Wray, in some of this open testimony and speeches is they're in our network. They're in our grid. They're placing malware where they want to place it. If there is going to be a conflict or even tension with the United States, they have a way to weaken us. This is a true first order, burn the house down national security threat, not visible to most of the public, but I think Director Wray tried to raise consciousness. I hope very much President Trump and his FBI director will focus on this issue.
All right. John Kerry, you worked a great deal on climate issues. Considering the state of support at the present time, are we headed in a dangerous direction in terms of the state of our climate?
Well, thanks, Leon. This is a really much bigger security challenge and challenge to our economy and to our existence than many people want to admit or acknowledge, which is really troublesome. It's amazing that some people can say, well, I accept the facts, but I don't think we have to move or respond now, et cetera. And some people willfully just distort the facts and don't want to deal with the reality of where we are, Leon. But look, folks, I've worked on this issue since 1988 when Jim Hansen, a NASA scientist, testified to a group of us in the United States Senate. Back then we were bipartisan. We had Senator John Warner, we had folks, Orrin Hatch, people who came on board, and everybody was curious. In 1992, we went to Rio with George H.W. Bush, bipartisan. And we tackled the issue. We came up with a voluntary formula by which nations would try to deal with the issue. Problem is they didn't deal with it. Business as usual. So we went to Kyoto. Kyoto came up with a mandatory mechanism. The United States Senate wouldn't accept anything mandatory. If China wasn't going to be part of it, the United States shouldn't be part of it. So that's a strange way to deal with the problem. We both won't do anything. And we didn't for a while. So then we get to the series, we get to Paris finally in 2015. I was serving as secretary. And we managed to get an agreement in Paris, and the hardest diplomacy, folks, I think Nick will agree, and HR and others, is multilateral. When you have 200 nations and you have to deal by consensus, and one country can just blow it all up. So we got an agreement in Paris that each country would put forward its own plan for what it would do, but that's the problem. It was voluntary. Each country would define its own plan, do what it wanted to do, and no country did enough to address the issue. So then finally, when I became the special envoy, we went to Glasgow, Sharm el-Sheikh, and Dubai, where we negotiated a series of events. I kept going to China starting in 2013, and I knew President Xi pretty well, still do, and the series of folks around him. And we built a process of mutual trust, mutual respect, dealing with the realities of the issue rather than any of the polemics or other challenges we face. Guess what? We got China to agree that they would, and they were building coal-fired power plants, which is the dirtiest fuel of all, the biggest single problem in what's going on. So folks, long story short, over the 35 plus years, 40 years we've been tracking this, we have seen every week, every year, every month be hotter than the one before. And now we are facing, literally, the hottest ever human history last January. It was 110 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 30 days in Phoenix last year. The runways were beginning to melt. You couldn't land planes, et cetera. I mean, you go through the series. 90% of the warming of the planet comes from the sun, goes into the ocean. And the ocean is now giving off far more moisture than it was previously. And that moisture travels around the world, falls in these torrential rains, et cetera. But the total changing of the climate around the world is changing the intensity of storms, the increased moisture, the increased wind gradient, the tornadoes you've seen the last days. I'll tell you, there isn't a scientist I know worth his or her salt who doesn't say it is going to get worse. Now, for 1970 to 2014, we saw a regular decade-by-decade increase of 0.2 degrees of centigrade of the warming of the planet. Stop. 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 4 years ago, they discovered a change in that. Now it's popped up to 0.3 degrees. And whereas we were headed towards 4 degrees of warming on the planet when I took over the job in 2021 when Joe Biden came in, we managed through huge efforts around the world. Germany now has deployed almost 50% of its power comes from renewables. Sun, solar, wind. The Chinese have now developed a sodium-ion battery that has the potential for much greater storage, so we can actually use solar and wind with battery packs that are commercially now available, and you can balance your grid, so you don't have your factories or your homes suddenly blacked out and browned out. Most people don't want to embrace this reality of what's happening. But the Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago said, big headline, the clean energy transition is unstoppable. And I'll bet everything I have on this, that we will become a low carbon, no carbon economy at some point in time because technology is moving and it will continue to move. Fusion, huge step forward in fusion. Different things happening with hydrogen, other fuels. So what we desperately need to do is not go backwards, but President Trump has pulled out of the Paris Agreement again, and he's killing all the money for offshore wind. And the uncertainty that has entered the marketplace is now palpable. We had the best economy in the world 4 months ago, January. Now, with the combination of tariffs and the junk going on to pull back from support from the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave incentives to do these things,
John.
we're now moving in the wrong direction. So just, folks, we've got to make this a voting issue. We've got to demand that we're going to respond. And last thing I'll say, this can be, we can win this battle. It's not sacrifice. It's abundance of energy. Let us win that fight of what the source will be, but you've got to capture the emissions. And right now they're still going up, folks. So we've got a big challenge to turn that around.
Okay, real quick here. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes remaining. I just want to ask you a quick question to wrap it up. As we've talked an awful lot about threats and dangers and flashpoints. What is your view about the future of our national security? Will America remain the strongest power on the face of the earth? And please keep your answers as short as possible.
Yeah, yes. I mean, since the late 19th century, we've been about 25% of the world's GDP. We are today. That increased after World War II. I have great faith in our institutions.
Your answer is no.
We will be. We will be the strongest power. Yes.
John?
Yes, sir. I agree completely. And part of the reason I feel that way is because of the career civil servants and the military and our career foreign diplomats who are on the job now and will be on the job, when the next president takes office.
Yeah. John?
Absolutely, we will be, and I believe in the extraordinary power of the marketplace. America has more creativity, more entrepreneurial capacity, better allocation of capital. We absolutely will deal with these things. The biggest challenges are going to be, do we deal with them in time?
Nick?
We have to be, but will only be, and prevent China from being the leader of the world if we reassert ourselves with our alliances and remember what made us great. Federal government sponsoring dollars into the universities, build up the universities, not take them down, and let the private sector of this country do what the private sector does brilliantly, bring ideas to market and monetize them. That's what made us great after World War II. We need to return to that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a great discussion this evening. I really appreciate all of our speakers coming because you've heard from some of the best people that have worked on foreign policy. This country is a great country. We all know and love what America's all about. But the challenge for this country is whether we, the people, do everything we can to make sure that our democracy remains strong and that we pass on to our children the kind of democracy that our parents passed on to us.
Hear, hear.
Hopefully that will happen. Good night. Thank you very much for being with us.